stars of night, thy people's everlasting light, O Christ.
Well, g'day and welcome to the Northern Illawarra Uniting Church Sermon Podcast for this week, September 1st. And it is really good to be with you. We are Bulli's Chapel on the Hill, making a way for people to come back home to God. Our reading today is from Isaiah, that great ancient prophet, chapter 61, verses 1 through 4. I'll put it up on the screen and let me read it for you. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and to release the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, and to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. And they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, to display his glory. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities and the devastations of many generations. The word of the Lord, and we'll get to this passage in just a moment. But to start with, I want to say I studied to be a minister at a college in New Jersey in the United States on the East Coast. And the very week that I began my studies was 1 week after the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington. And since the school was so close, the impact of those attacks was felt deeply by this whole incoming class of students and all the professors there. And I remember my very first day of class, we were all wondering what we were supposed to be doing. What were we doing here studying with everything else going on in the world? What good was it? And I distinctly remember in that first class, my philosophy professor, his name was Diogenes Allen, if you can believe it, stood up and shared a story that I'll never forget. At first, we didn't understand where the story was going, but it became clear soon enough. And this first class, he started talking about the revolution in England in 1653, all the way back in history, when he said Oliver Cromwell and the Puritan regime started tearing up churches, smashing stained glass windows, throwing out organs and church bells, and defacing all the interior decoration. It was a great revolution in the church. But during that time, there was a nobleman, he said, called Robert Shirley, who built a little church in a village called Harold Staunton, with carved woodwork, painted ceilings, stained glass, windows, and organ and church bells. Just the sort of thing that was completely out of style, in fact, almost illegal in those days. And this act of defiance by Robert Shirley was punished by being imprisoned in the Tower of London. He, in fact, died there 3 years after the church was completed. But the professor went on to say that years later, when the hysteria about these churches had subsided, an inscription was finally placed to the memory of Robert Shirley above the main entrance to the church door. And anyone who enters the church, even today, can read this inscription. I'll put it up on the screen for you. It's Old English, so bear with me. In the year 1653, when all things sacred were throughout the nation either demolished or profaned, Sir Robert Shirley, Baronet, founded this church, whose singular praise it is to have done the best things in the worst times and hoped them in the most calamitous. And remember the professor pausing and saying to have done the best of things in the worst of times and to hope them in the most calamitous. Our professor's message was clear. I hope it's clear to you that it's easy to knock things down. It's hard to build them. But there is nothing better than building something good in the face of the world falling apart. It means hoping for the future. Now, why do I bring all of this up? Well, for us in our church here at Northern Illawarra, September 1st is turning out to be a full day. It has everything to do with what we are building. Firstly, it is the beginning, this September 1st, of Creation Tide, a relatively new season in the life of the church, in which we honor God as creator of all life and seek to bless the creation of which we are a part. Now, this is a relatively new celebration in the life of the church, and it's long overdue, I think. And we celebrate creation because we need to care for our home, but also because we as Christians believe that our relationship with God, with the spiritual, is never disconnected from the physical world around us. So we start Creation Tide today. But secondly, on September 1st, it's the day that we in our church start a capital campaign, an effort to fundraise for the work of the restoration in our Heritage Chapel. Over September and October, we hope to raise about $180,000 to help repair major cracking in the facade of our building, to repoint the sandstone bricks, and to recover the chapel for the full use of our worshiping life. The chapel here, and you can see it behind me, this chapel has stood for 165 years and is one of the oldest buildings in our town, a place of communal worship, fellowship, grief, and joy. And this is Bulli's chapel on the hill, as we often say, and it's one of the treasures of our church and a treasure of our wider community. So that's also happening today. But thirdly, September 1st is also Father's Day here in Australia, and the day in which the calendar tells us that we remember and give thanks for our dads. Creation, a capital campaign, and Father's Day. They may seem strangely different, but they are all actually asking the same question. What are we building? Because I believe that today I want to say to be a builder is core to our human identity. It is what we are made to do. Our world gives us so many alternative identities. An advertisement would tell you that you're a consumer, that your calling is to shop, to buy, to consume, and our oceans are swamped with the waste products of all that we have consumed. A politician might tell us that our identity is that of a voter. You are meant to have opinions and a voice, telling leaders what to do or complaining when they don't do it. And my goodness, our airwaves and our social media are full of people telling us loudly what they think. Our corporations tell us that we are workers. Our identity is to do and to keep busy. We're never quite sure what for, but the money is good and the benefits are good, and we keep working enough, and so eventually we can stop or something. Our culture would tell us that our identity is an individual, unique and special, and we're meant to express ourselves in our own unique and special way. Our whole identity is about expressing ourselves. And our world is full of people desperately watching other people trying to figure out exactly what kind of individual that they can model themselves after. But what we're talking about today, what Creation Tide tells us, what a church community tells us, what Father's Day points us to, all the way back to the very first, the core primeval identity that humanity received. We go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, the beginning of the Christian story. As soon as God has made the first man, Adam, God places him in the Garden of Eden. And in Genesis chapter 2, we read, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend it and to keep it. It's our first identity, these first verbs, these first doing words given to humanity, to tend the garden and to keep it. And the word that we translate tend or work means to make things grow, to nurture, to cultivate, to build up and to oversee. And the word translated as to protect or keep means to watch over, to maintain, to guard, to look after what has been grown. And these two words sum up what we're called to do. That's what the garden needs, and that's what we are for, to tend and to keep the garden. And in tending and keeping this garden, we find God. We find all these beautiful images in the first couple of chapters of Genesis of God walking and talking with Adam and Eve in the garden. And in working and keeping this garden, we find our life. Eden is where we find that beautiful image of the tree of life. Everything good grows as we tend and keep the garden. And in this garden, we find our relationship with one another. It's where Adam and Eve meet and are commanded to be fruitful and multiply. Friends, it's in this garden, this call to grow and to tend, that humanity finds its original purpose and place. We are gardeners. Life is made in a commitment to a place, in a set of divine and human relationships, in caring for what we have been given. But it's not quite that simple, though, is it? We'd love to go back to that garden, but as the Bible puts it, we have been put out of the Garden of Eden. And as our culture puts it, things fall apart. There's weeds, there's problems with our garden. And so when it comes to our garden, there's a lot of work to do, digging up dead stumps, pulling out weeds, clearing overgrown beds that have gone to seed. The garden around us needs work. But I'd push even further and say that the garden situation has become complicated. as well, because there are a lot of us. The garden is no longer sufficient to look after us. Our societies have become more complicated and interdependent. The image of a garden is nice, but it feels a little dated. I mean, I think about it, it's nice to have a garden that I work in, but I wouldn't want to depend on my whole livelihood on my own garden. I watched a video the other day of somebody who made a chicken sandwich out of his own efforts. Everything he made, the bread, the chicken, the veggies, the mayonnaise, it was all made by himself. It took him 6 months and $1,500 just to make one chicken sandwich. So in some ways, this idea of a garden is not sufficient. We need a fuller image. And the Bible is not naive about this, because as you read through the scriptures, we start with the garden, but the imagery starts to change. The dream in a broken world is not to return to Eden, but to build Jerusalem, a good and a godly city in the place of a garden. You can summarize the story of the Bible by saying it starts in a garden, but it ends in the city. And it's quite the journey, because at the beginning, the city is a bad thing, a source of violence and exploitation and environmental degradation. The Tower of Babel, that great early story in Genesis, the first real example of a city, and it's not good news. It's the opposite of the life-giving garden. But over time, the prophets in ancient Israel begin to point to a renewal, not just of a garden. We don't just get back to Eden, but we could possibly renew the city, a new Jerusalem where people find a home and learn to cooperate and plant farms and tend animals and make many more gardens. It's a more complicated picture, but it's a better picture as well. And right at the end of the scriptures in Revelation, we see the new Jerusalem, the godly city coming down. And in the middle of the city, what do we find? We find that same tree of life that began in Eden. The good garden has become the great and good city. So this brings us all the way back to the text we read today, Isaiah 61. And this is a prophecy that takes place right in the middle of that journey between the garden and the city, between the garden going to seed and the new Jerusalem. And this prophetic word gives us our calling, no longer just tending and keeping a garden, but rebuilding a city. And it's in this passage that it's most beautifully and succinctly put. We read that God will raise up his people to be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, to display his glory. And we're told that the work of this people is to build up the ancient ruins, to raise up the former devastations, and repair the ruined cities. So what are we? Says the prophet. What does it mean to be human? Ask the scriptures. Friends, we are made to be builders of a good city in every sense of the word. To take what's been knocked down, what's been destroyed, what's been neglected, and restore it. That's what creation and a capital campaign and Father's Day all have in common. They are all central to our calling as humans, to build and, if necessary, to rebuild. That's who we are. We're not consumers simply taking what's been passed on to us by former generations. We're builders who add good and the commonwealth to the world that we live in, protecting and stewarding the resources that we've been given. We're not just voters full of opinions and critiques, complaining about the things our leaders do and fail to do. We're not just standing on our rights. We're called, our identity is to help make things right, to be builders. And we're not just workers doing our job, doing what we're told, focused on our own wealth creation and eventually released from service when we retire. No, we are co-owners in this world. We share together in the meaningful ownership of community, offering what we can without expectation of payment. And perhaps most importantly, we are not just individuals. We are members of a community, fathers, mothers and children, aunts and uncles and sisters and brothers, friends and neighbors, made whole by the responsibility that we take one for another. To sum it all up, we are builders, called into a great work of tending, protecting, and building a world that reflects the justice and generosity of God. We are made to build good societies that care for our creation. We are made to build communities that give life and health, and we are made to build families that flourish. And so my question for us today, whether you're a member of this church or wherever you are, it's a simple one. What are you building? Where are you rolling up your sleeves? What are you taking responsibility for? I can answer that question for myself. As a minister, I'm called to build up the people to know and to love the God who made them, and in so doing, help people to love this world better. And as a member of this church community of which I'm a part, I'm called to help grow and protect this church, to steward this little chapel on the hill and everything that it means that was passed on to us. And as a father, I'm called to raise and protect my family. Those are my identities. That is my calling, and I consider it an incredible privilege to share in this calling with all of you. Now, your calling is going to look different in some ways, but some of it we share. If you're a member of this community church, this little chapel on the hill is such a gift. I think it's worth sacrificing for. I think it's worth rebuilding, not just for the building's sake, but for the community that gathers in it and draws meaning from it. I think it's worth preserving so that we can pass it on to generations to come. Friends, back on that early day, 25 years ago, sitting and listening about these terrible crimes on 9/11, it's easy to consume and it's easy to destroy. We see that so often in our world today. It happens so quickly. But the work of building is beautiful and good. And God has raised up builders like you and me, calling us to do the slow and loving work of rebuilding the ruins. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And by the way, this capital campaign is for those who call this church home. But if you're listening in and you'd like to share in that work, we'll put some details in the description of this video. You'd be welcome to join in. Friends, have a great week.